Hello, my angels, and welcome to my living room. This is my first try, so we're going to see how this goes. I'm going to break the note sessions down into about 12-minute segments so that you're not overwhelmed and you don't have to listen to me for a very long time. You can take breaks and do what you need to do. So, we're going to start with the Great Depression and the New Deal, which is immediately following the crash of 1929, the stock market crash that we were talking about when we left school before. So the economic depression that takes place. Oh, look, my cat's coming. Hello, cat. Hi, you're not helping, Jack. Can you move? Can you move? Thank you, Jackie. Okay, bye, Jackie. All right. So, at the beginning of the Depression, Herbert Hoover is still the president, and then that will change. Oh, why aren't you advancing the slide as I need you to? There we go. All right. So, just to kind of review the information that we've been talking about before, we had talked about how the end of World War I had impacted the economy. We had lots of unemployed people. We had reduced need for manufacturing. Our European allies weren't able to purchase the goods that we had, so we see a huge economic drop. We also see what we call the wealth inequality, which is where the wealth, the resources were focused mainly at the top. The top wealthiest people owned far more than the bottom percentages did. Now, the thing that's really interesting, I have here in the presentation 2017, but that number has continued to grow. And actually, right now, we have an economic inequality that is worse than it was in 1929. So think about that for a second. And that's why these bills have been passed to pump money into the economy, both through grants to people, grants to small businesses, grants to large businesses, because we are trying desperately to avoid another economic collapse. Now, the situation we're in now is different, but there are a lot of similarities. But let's get back to the 1930s. So we talked about how wheat being the primary crop that is no longer needed in great demand because the war is over. So the prices on that are going to fluctuate. We're going to see farmers losing money and losing their farms. And then we talked about when we got to the 1920s and the flappers and the electricity in people's houses and the advancement of the automobile and electronic equipment. And so we see people buying things with money they don't have. And again, that's going to be problematic. So they purchase on credit, and they purchase stock on credit, and then the economy is going to collapse. There's a combination of things that happen. It's not just the war. It's not just buying on credit. There is land speculation in Florida, and there's a major hurricane. And don't forget that our allies overseas have weak economies, and we see the growth of those fascist governments in Italy and Germany. And we see a lot of labor unrest. We see unhappy people across the Western world who are protesting and rioting and things. So, communism, we see a lot of things going on. So a lot of things play into this economic collapse. But most countries blame the United States. That's not surprising, is it? But most countries blame the United States for the collapse and then the subsequent collapse of the economies around the globe. All right, so we remember, if you can, that we played the stock market game before you left school. And then we had massive drops in the stock market over the course of a couple days. Now, the stock market is not the economy, and I say this even today. You know, the economy is much larger than just the stock market. It's the people and the gross national product, and it is banks and it's businesses and all that stuff. So it's not just the stock market, but most people see the stock market as an indicator of financial health for the nation. And so when the stock market crashes, people lose faith in the system. And we will see what we call a run on the banks. And we'll talk about that in a second. So once we have our depression, once our economic collapse happens, we're a global network then, we're a global network now, and the European markets follow us, right? We're all interconnected. in this planet. We didn't have social media, but we did have connected economic systems. And like we said, that has great big ties to World War One and the destruction that happened in Europe and the collapse. Remember, the farm fields were used as the battlefields, so you've got to recover. I mean, even today, there are squads that come by and pick up the bombs that they find when they plow the fields every year. So it's still impacting what farmers are doing. So imagine trying to reclaim your farmland after millions of Germans have been living on it for the last 4 years. So they're in dire straits. We talked about this before also, but it's good to review that a large percentage of the population is out of work. So 9%, that's a lot. At the height of the Depression, it's 25%. And interesting, let's make another modern day comparison since we have the opportunity, is that the expectation that the unemployment rate related to the coronavirus crisis is estimated between 20 and 30% when it's all said and done. So I think we're at 18% right now. 18% of the population has been laid off suddenly because of the shutdowns and the closures. And maybe you know that at home. Maybe you have been laid off your part-time job. Maybe your parents are home bugging you all day long, right? That's me. I'm not alone all day. I'm constantly surrounded by people, which is why I'm making this video at 11:30 at night, because everyone else is asleep, except for my cat, apparently. So people went through pay cuts. One time I found a book in a used bookstore, and in it was a letter to a teacher. It was really pretty amazing. And the letter was telling the teacher that he was going to have his pay cut and that they were sorry, but there was nothing they could do. And because there were no other jobs available, people kept those jobs and you worked for less. So you did the same job for less money because you didn't really have a choice to do anything different. All right, so Herbert Hoover, he's our president at the time. If you remember, Herbert Hoover was in charge of the food system in World War I. He was responsible to make sure that there was enough food for the troops and food for the starving populations overseas. And he depended then mostly on donations. He didn't want to put any laws in place. And for the most part, that's the same thing he does here, is he doesn't really put a lot of legislation into place. He doesn't really make an attempt to do anything. And he's hoping that things are just going to fix themselves. And they just don't do that. This is interesting here. There's so many modern comparisons to this. It's really intriguing. So they didn't want to do a lot of, they didn't want to pass any legislation to help unemployed people. Now, in the 1930s, the United States didn't have any kind of social safety net, no Social Security, no workman's comp. None of those things existed. So, when people said, hey, 25% of the population is unemployed, maybe we should do something about that. You remember that idea of social Darwinism, and they're like, look, if we give them money, that's not going to really help anything. They're just going to waste it. Not realizing that, even if they waste it, they're putting that money back into the economy. And it's funny because, again, now I know you guys probably aren't watching C-SPAN and watching the Senate debate about the bills that they're passing, but I'm so thrilling that I do. And it was intriguing to me to see senators make these same arguments that, the poor shouldn't get a stimulus check. The poor shouldn't get unemployment insurance. But luckily, that was overruled. And there will be help for the masses of unemployed people, and hopefully we'll be able to avoid a complete economic collapse as a result of this virus, which is what, people are really freaking out about that. So they do try and help banks, but they're not going to do enough to help banks, and we're going to have what's called a run on the bank. So we'll talk about that. And not surprisingly, people are angry. People are hungry. When people have no food, when people have nothing left to live for, then they will hit the streets. When people are starving, they've got no other choice. They will protest, they will riot, and that's what happens. It can happen, well, maybe not now because no one wants to get the coronavirus, but this is what happens when populations are not having their needs met. That's what my whole career is based on, teaching you about people who have overthrown their governments because they're not getting their needs met. We see communism and the popularity of communism grow dramatically because communism seems like a great answer, right? The idea that there's no profit motive, that people aren't going to get wealthy off your labor, the idea that you'll have everything you need provided for you. I mean, that's pretty powerful when you're talking about a large percentage of the population who are now unemployed, hungry. Many people lose their homes. In fact, they build home like villages outside of towns, and people are living in their cars and living in cardboard boxes and living in tents, and they call them Hoovervilles. And a Hoover blanket, that's a newspaper. So you don't have a blanket, you cover yourself with newspapers. All right. So Hoover takes the blame for a lot of this crisis. Now, is he at fault for the economy collapsing? No. But it's his responsibility as the president to make choices that are going to help the population, and he just is not able to do that. So, one of the other events, the last thing I'm going to talk about before I hit the pause button, is what's called the bonus army. So, World War I veterans were promised a bonus if at a certain point in the future, I forget what year it was. Oh, 1945. I have it right there in my notes. But these people, now the idea is the government's going to give them this bonus money in 1945. Life expectancy was not anywhere near where it is today. I think the life expectancy was in the high 40s, low 50s. So the idea was that most of those people aren't going to live that long, and they're not going to have to pay those payments out. So it's only $1,000, but $1,000 then was a lot more than it is now. So these World War I veterans went to D.C. and pitched tents in front of the White House and protested because they're like, look, we served our country. You promised us this money. We need it now so that we can survive. And instead of, treating them like with the respect that we try to treat veterans with today, they sent the army out after them and shot into the camp and actually killed an infant and chased him out of there and didn't give him their money. So, that's, happiness. All right. So we've taken a really good look at what built up to the stock market collapse. And in the next section, we're going to talk about the election of FDR and how he starts to turn things around. Thanks so much.